Thank you, Joy. Mr. Howard, Mr. Jones, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's 5 long decades since I first met John Howard at the Sydney University Law School, when it was the law school in the state, the only law school. And we didn't really meet. We acknowledged one another and grew to know one another. But may I say to that appalling shoe thrower in Cambridge that, and I can say this with exquisite personal authority, that John Howard wasn't then a racist, and he's not a racist now. And all that silly young man has achieved is to make us the butt of more English jokes, such as, after that bowling, you can see how they lost the Ashes. But to return to the Law School of Sydney, the young men of our year and the very small number of young ladies, if they had been asked, who amongst us would have become Prime Minister of Australia, I think we would probably have said, that most confident of young men of our year, the man who ignored the convention of complete silence during lectures, who would intervene and propound his views, that confident young man might have become Prime Minister, and that was, of course, Marcus Einfeld. But that honour didn't descend on Marcus, it descended on John. A few years ago, Gough Whitlam was interviewed on the 7:30 report. It was a tour d'horizon of his whole career. And at the end, Kerry O'Brien said, and Mr. Whitlam, tell me, who were the 3 greatest Prime Ministers of Australia? And Gough looked at him. And as you know, there's nothing that television hates more than a pause. And Gough continued to look at him, and Kerry began to look very worried, and eventually Gough said, I'm still trying to think of the other 2. There is no doubt in my mind among the leaders of this country that John Howard ranks among the greatest. The happy economic state of this country, compared with others, and the consequent profligacy of the government, is the result of those careful years of husbanding, those setting up of a system of regulation which has proved to be the best in the world, and also the fact that, unusually in recent years, from opposition he supported sensible measures. He's also, I think, to be honoured for his role in foreign affairs and defence, and that he inserted the entry of Australia into the highest councils of the world, and above all, he removed that crippling and silly proposition that we had to choose between being friendly with the Asian countries to the north and being friendly with our great and powerful friends. It's a sad thing that when, in the year he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, which, as you know, is awarded by a Norwegian committee, it was the same year, or very, very soon after, that a Norwegian ship, the Tampa, was hijacked by people claiming to be asylum seekers in Australia, and the Norwegian committee performed in that year as well as it did this year. His most singular achievement for us today is that he fulfilled, in many ways, the mission of ACM. He preserved, protected and defended the constitutional system of this country, the role of the Crown in it, and the Australian flag. And, in addition, he allowed the Republicans to test their proposition before the only court which could decide that, the Australian people. In 1998, I recall vividly that on the very same day that a Republican model emerged with the support of the overwhelming majority of Republicans from the convention, but slipped in failing in getting an absolute majority. He immediately ruled that that was the model to go to the Australian people for decision. And the Republicans, you might recall, on that occasion, enthusiastically praised him. The commentariat was unanimous. But when, a year later, they lost the referendum they wanted, instead of blaming themselves, they established two myths. The first myth was, oh, well, John Howard fixed the convention. There were 36 seats at the convention which were in the gift of the Prime Minister. He awarded them to balance those not represented, young people and Aborigines, and some seats for most eminent Australians. Of those 36 seats, only 10 voted in the same way that John Howard did, some fixing. It's also said he fixed the question. He didn't. The Republicans did ask something which he refused. That was, they said, take out two words from the question. Firstly, take out the word president, and secondly, believe it or not, take out the word republic. You can guess what their focus groups were telling them. Well, he didn't, but he also didn't accede to our request. ACM said, you've got the description of the appointment, but you haven't got the description of the way he's to be dismissed, because the President can be dismissed by the Prime Minister without notice, without reasons, and without appeal. And this was an extraordinary proposition. But he also refused that. He gave everybody a fair go. The Republicans could not have had a fairer go in 1999. And if you compare the convention with the 2020 summit, you'll immediately grasp that. The convention was chosen by a mix of election, ex officio, and a balance to try and make sure everybody was represented. The summit was of the best and brightest. In other words, it was an elitist summit. It was the subject of the biggest gerrymander ever seen in Australian history, when on the governance panel 98 Republicans were chosen and one constitutional monarchist slipped through, probably because they thought he was a Republican. The convention was chaired properly. The two chairmen were experienced chairmen, Ian Sinclair and Barry Jones. They both happened to be Republicans. What happened at the summit? Mr. Rudd said, I'll be the chairman and I'll make my closest friend the Vice-Chancellor at Melbourne University, the other chairman. And then, how was the convention run? The convention was run properly, with Hansard, with proper parliamentary procedures. The summit was so badly run that Robert Mann, Professor Robert Mann, the Republican, said it had degenerated into a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the fact is the Republicans were given a vote. They were given a vote at the most auspicious time for change. Remember, it was the time of the new century, the new millennium, the centenary of Federation, and when the royal family had passed through some unfortunate matrimonial difficulties. And as Giles said, the result was a landslide in all states and 72% of federal electorates. The Republicans demean themselves when they attack John Howard for their loss. Today we're about to honour the man, and it's my honour for me to introduce him, who preserved what those who've gone before us bequeathed to us, that is, the indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honour to introduce Mr. John Howard AC.